Hello again, and this is the last video for this introduction chapter. I feel like it's been kind of long, but I really felt the need to sort of fill in some gaps for you, since we are going to be using this as like the foundation for the year. And if you've gotten this far, I appreciate it. So we left off talking about the Avignon Papacy and the Great Schism, and how those things really combined to really um, make the church lose a lot of face. It lost its reputation, it lost a lot of its prestige. But along with that, too, though, comes a change in culture. So, culture, usually when we think of culture, we usually think of things like art and society and literature and what people do for the most part. And of course, the 14th century being a very crazy, sort of calamitous century that is going to be very defining, is going to change people's culture as well. So, let's take a look, for example, first of all, the fact that people started to veer away a little bit from the church. Now, it does not mean that people stopped believing in the church or that they stopped believing in God. People were still actually very religious. They just started looking for other avenues of knowledge. And one of the ways you do that is by starting to look for literature, if you were a literate person, that is not in Latin. Most literature was in Latin because Latin was the religion or was the language of the educated. It was the language of the church. Most sermons in church or masses, as they're called in the Catholic Church, were performed in Latin. So Latin was the intellectual elite language. It still is today, actually. So people started to write actually instead in a way to reach sort of more lay people or common people by writing in what is called the vernacular literature. So the word vernacular just means the language one speaks, such as your vernacular would be American English, as opposed to Latin or Greek, whatever as the case may be. So first, this really kind of takes off in Italy with the works of three major writers, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. So why in Italy? Well, Italy was the birthplace of the Renaissance, which is where we're going to see this. It has a lot to do with the fact that in order to have an education, you must be wealthy, and northern Italian merchant classes were fairly wealthy and had the time to devote to um, education in the arts and literature. It also just has to do with the fact that in Italy, which had been struck the most by um, the problems within the papacy and also by the plague, people started to look towards literature as a sort of like an escape from reality. And so it becomes really popular. Now, again, when I say people, I really mean educated people. The peasants, they're still not reading it. Um, so again, when we talk about the vernacular, though, there was really no like standardized way of spelling words or even speaking. In different parts of any given country, you could have different dialects. Like in Italy, there was Italian, but depending on where you were, their Italian was spoken differently. People in Genoa spoke differently than people in, let's say, Naples. It was these writers that actually standardized the Italian language, including their spelling. And so Dante Alighieri, for example, he's known as the father of the Italian language. So let's look at a little bit of this too, and this is really going to lead to the the Renaissance, its origins in Italy as well. So since Florence, which is a city in sort of northern central Italy, Florence is in this region called Tuscany, and Tuscany's dialect really becomes the basis for the modern Italian language. It just so happens to be that's where Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio were from. So some of these writers, again, let's go with Dante Alighieri. He was a writer, and he wrote in Italian as opposed to Latin. It makes it easier for people to understand as well. And he wrote this book called The Divine Comedy. Again, not necessarily non-religious. The Divine Comedy is actually a book about a person who dies, and he takes this journey through all of the different levels, from heaven into purgatory and hell. And he has a different spiritual guide through each one of them. And it's meant to be sort of like this tragic comedy to look at the absurdity sometimes of human existence. Francesco Petrarca, or sometimes we just call him Petrarch, who also lived during this time, and all of these men were sort of contemporaries of each other. He was famous for his sonnets. He made love sonnets especially very famous, and so his writing was very emotional, which is something that people could really relate to at the time. His sonnets, the ones that he was the most famous for, were sonnets that he wrote to a woman he was in love with named Laura, who was married. So it was this sort of unrequited love. And unrequited love is often associated with suffering, and that was something that people could really just relate to back then. He also wrote a lot of different other works, in particular in which he criticized sometimes the practices of the church. And then Giovanni Boccaccio, of course, wrote the Decameron, which I talked about earlier, and which is a story of about these peasants who go ride out the storm of the plague, and they pass the time by telling each other these sort of like sometimes funny, sometimes naughty, and sometimes very serious and sad, tragic stories. Now, it wasn't just the Italians who did this. There was also a very famous English writer who we can thank for our standardized English, or at least partially thank him. His name was Geoffrey Chaucer, and he lived during this time as well, and he wrote a book very similar to the Decameron called the Canterbury Tales. It was sort of the English version of that. And it was his writing that helped kind of lead the way towards this sort of like standardization of language. And then there were some women involved as well. Christine de Pizan was actually a French woman who was raised in the French court, and she was the only daughter of a count who, because she had money and privilege and was raised in French court amongst French royalty, she was incredibly well educated, and she wrote a book called The Book of the City of Ladies, which we will be talking about a little bit more later, about how women can benefit from education as well, just as much as men can, and why shouldn't women have a say in things that affect their daily lives. So we're going to look a little bit more at some of these writers a little bit more, particularly Petrarch, who is considered to be really the father of the Renaissance and humanism, which is a huge part of the Renaissance. But art also changes as well. Now, this is medieval art, and when you look at a painting like this, it certainly can be emotional. Clearly, it's a picture of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which is the cornerstone of faith for Christianity. In the painting, you can see, first of all, it's kind of flat and one-dimensional. And while there is this sort of like emotional image, the painting itself does not look realistic. It's almost somewhat cartoon-like. Jesus himself doesn't look very realistic. His body's sort of contorted and not really to scale. He has a giant halo over his head, and he certainly looks, except for the wounds on his hands and feet and in his ribs, he kind of looks rather clean cut for what had really happened to him. And if you look at the expressions of the faces around him, the people are all around him, there's no like depth or perception. Everyone's very flat, one-dimensional. Their faces are not very expressive. They're just kind of standing there. You can tell that some of the people are meant to be saints because some of them have halos around around their heads as well. They're pretty big. You can't miss them. But for the most part, when you look at a painting like this, you notice that it's not very realistic looking, flat, sort of two-dimensional, and kind of not really, doesn't really even look human. Art starts to change a little bit as we move out of the Middle Ages and we kind of start getting to the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is going to be our very first unit in class. And a lot of people think that the Renaissance is just about art. Now, art's a very important part of the Renaissance, but art is just a reflection or a mirror of cultural values. And as people started to kind of veer away from the church as a source of ultimate knowledge, they start to look more at human knowledge and the human brain and what it's capable of, and human skills. And we start to notice that change as well in art, especially when we look at this. So we're going to be looking at art of this artist named Giotto, who was from Florence. He was born a peasant, and he kind of is the very first realistic painter. His art takes on a very different style. It's like this sort of kind of realism. His paintings looked more human, and they were really mixed with like this older Byzantine style, which was the style of the painting I just showed you, which kind of had that old like gold flat look. And it was really in Giotto that we start to see the origins of Renaissance art, as art becomes more humanistic and realistic as well. So here's a painting by Giotto called The Crucifixion. Now, the subject matter is actually the same as the painting I showed you before, which was also the crucifixion of Christ. But there are some slight differences. First of all, it's not gold, and it was very common for art in medieval ages to be gold, like to have gold backgrounds. Um, it was called the Byzantine style. Perhaps that's because it was meant to look wealthy, since art was for the wealthy and for the churches. This one, however, is blue, and blue is often a color that is associated with heaven or celestial beings. You also notice that Jesus actually looks slightly more realistic. He has muscle definition in his legs, in his ribs, and in his stomach, and his arms are longer. He definitely appears to be suffering more if you look at his face. Um, his wounds are not as bloody in this painting, but overall, it just seems like a more realistic depiction, save for the angels that are flying all around him. But the thing that you notice about the angels, though, is that they are small. In other words, this painting is actually more to scale, mathematically speaking, which is important because that actually makes it look realistic. Another thing that you will notice too is that the people below him, the people who are mourning and lamenting for his crucifixion, for example, Mary at the bottom, and she's the one in blue who's sort of being held up by these other two female figures. She looks like a very sorrowful, mourning mother. There's even detail in the clothing that they are wearing if you look very closely. The woman who's sort of touching Jesus' feet, that's Mary Magdalene. You can tell because of the long red hair, and she's also kind of in this pose of like sorrow and mourning, but at the same time worship. If you look at the faces of the women who are consoling Mary, they look on their faces like they have facial expressions of concern and sorrow for her. On the right, you see again like some people look angry, some people look scared and or nervous or shocked and in awe, as they hold up as well the shroud that's there at the bottom. So it's sort of just a more realistic painting. This was really done. This was kind of Giotto's way of expressing human ability, that you don't have to make everything look like it's otherworldly, but by making things more human looking, it is also a way to sort of kind of praise what we are capable of, which is really what the Renaissance is going to be about. Here's another painting by Giotto as well called The Lamentation. Again, a similar subject matter. And you'll notice too, biblical. It's religious art. At this point, we're still in a point really where most art is religious in nature. And most art was really, that's probably because most art was commissioned by the church. That's who paid the artists to do, to create their masterpieces. Again, here, this is a scene where Jesus has now been lowered from the cross, and it's some of the same characters. You see Mary is holding holding Jesus' head, and Mary is always wearing blue, as you can tell. So some of the other saints and apostles are around him, and they're all kind of looking at him. But there's sort of like concerned, shocked, sad, but also rather kind of hopeful faces, or sometimes expressions of shock. Once again, you see Mary Magdalene washing his feet with her hair, which was a biblical story. So you can see the kind of like realistic human side of art. And by making these religious figures look more human, it makes them look more attainable. So we start to see how art is reflecting the way that people start to feel about themselves. That the fact that human beings feel that their victories against adversity can be celebrated by basically just depicting them as more realistic. Sounds odd, but that's actually going to be one of the driving forces of the Renaissance. The society is going to change as well. Cities changed, urban life changed as well due to the plague. Cities got cleaner, slightly cleaner. It was still the 1500s. Nothing was really that clean. But they did close down bathhouses. They started to regulate and tax prostitution. You might be wondering, well, why didn't they just get rid of it? I mean, prostitution seems like a good way to spread disease. And the reason, of course, is that the church sanctioned prostitution and believed it should be legal. They thought it was a sin, but they figured it was better to have prostitutes than to have gentlemen trying to seduce virgins or anything like that. Finally, of course, there were some slight variances in family and gender roles, but not too much. For the most part, the household had its basic nuclear family, parents, children, perhaps some grandparents. Wealthier homes included their servants, their apprentices, other family members, unmarried sisters, widowed sisters, usually it was women, um, in laws, uncles, perhaps that were in need of a home. After the plague, people started to marry a lot younger. That makes a lot of sense since, people realized life is short, gotta propagate the species sooner, I guess. Women, of course, did have very limited rights. They did not have rights to, say, abortion, obviously abortions. They didn't have rights to divorce or anything like that. It was something that could only be, um, a man could ask for an annulment of marriage, but a woman usually could not. So, for children, there was some schooling that was available for boys, but that was mostly only in the West, or apprenticeship programs. There were a lot more hospitals that were founded for foundlings and orphans. Foundlings were abandoned children. But more than anything, probably one of the things that really makes a lot of strides here is medicine. So, medicine really started to change as a result of the plague, but not in the way that you would think. Most physicians were actually priests and clergymen and bishops. They were educated, so they went to school, to colleges and universities where they studied to be physicians or they studied medicine. But they weren't studying real medicine, not the way that people study them today. They were reading theories about medicine, and these theories dated all the way back to ancient Greece. Um, so basically, long story short, their study of medicine was for the most part useless because the ancient Greeks were pretty smart, but they really didn't know jack about medicine. So it was actually the nuns who actually had real clinical practice. It was the nuns who lived in the convents, who took care of the sick and the dying, who helped women give birth often, especially in hospitals, um, who sometimes even acted as midwives, who took care of orphans. And during the plague, they had really taken a front and center role in taking care of the sick and dying. And one of the things that nuns did was they kept a record of things that worked and things that didn't work when treating the sick and dying. For example, it was nuns that realized that keeping a clean hospital actually seemed to lessen the spread of disease. So, in a sense, nuns were really like the first nurses. Have you ever noticed that their headpieces are somewhat the same? The old school, like nurse hats that nurses used to wear, they sometimes kind of resemble nuns' habits. And then, of course, the medicine that was studied by the doctors. These ancient Greek physicians, they studied um, and passed on their knowledge, so to knowledge in quotations, to these scholars of medicine. Now, it used to be believed that we had four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And when we were sick, it was because one of these things was out of balance. Now, balance, probably that's believable. But the rest of this is pretty much nonsense, as almost anyone with any kind of medical knowledge can tell you. Um, for the most part, there was like this medical hierarchy that took place in the Middle Ages. Physicians were at the very top. These were the clergymen who were educated, but they only studied theories. While they had been in medical school, they had never even dissected a dead body. Below them were surgeons, and surgeons also acted, in other capacities. But these surgeons were really more than anything, they were butchers. They didn't really wash their hands. They didn't keep clean instruments, and usually having surgery back then meant you were going to die. Then there were midwives, and midwives were always women. Their job was to help women deliver babies, which was very dangerous and often ended in death or tragedy. Um, More on those later. And then there were barber surgeons, which were usually in some of these other smaller villages. These were men who were barbers. They cut hair, but they also doubled as surgeons and sometimes also as dentists who pulled teeth. This was a practice that actually continued well into the 1800s, even in the United States, as America became a country. There were barber surgeons rather than doctors in most towns and villages. And then below them, of course, were apothecaries, which were kind of like pharmacists, I guess. They were responsible for mixing herbs and minerals to create salves and potions and other medicines that were supposed to help you. none of them could do anything about the plague, and so it really seemed to a lot of people like some kind of scientific inquiry was desperately needed. However, this was also a time period of major new inventions that are going to change society. So it wasn't like in the 14th century, everybody was asleep at the wheel. The 14th century was when the clock was invented. This changes the way we do business, it changes the way we work, it changed the way we trade, it changed everything because now our lives could be controlled by more than simply just the rising and setting of the sun. Eyeglasses, kind of a big deal, especially if you want to read. This is the fact that eyeglasses were invented just goes to show that literacy was growing as well. It could be that paper was invented at this time as well, which is cheaper than parchment, and it made books a little bit more available. Not too much though, since the printing press isn't going to be invented for another few years. And finally, the big one probably that changed life the most at this point was gunpowder and cannons, at least for the military and for monarchs. Gunpowder was invented by the Chinese, but it was actually then turned into cannons later on by Europeans, and it made castles and city walls pointless and obsolete since cannons can actually crash those things down. So it changes warfare as well. Anyway, that is the end of my introductory chapter, and I hope that you have found this to be a little bit more useful, or sometimes people have questions about the language and the vocabulary in AP Euro textbooks, and I hope that I've been able to help you out. I can't wait to see you guys in class, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me.